What if the New York you carry in your mind, the cinematic version, the dreamlike backdrop, the electric city that never disappoints, has already disappeared without you noticing? What if the place you imagine is nothing more than a memory of a different era, kept alive only by movies, nostalgia, and the stories of people who still see the city through the lens of the past? This is the uncomfortable question most visitors avoid, yet it shapes every moment they spend walking through the real New York of today. Because the New York that exists now feels heavier, more worn, more unpredictable, and far less magical than the one the world still romanticizes. You feel this shift the moment you step onto the streets. The city still tries to perform its old identity, the bright lights, the rushing crowds, the towering symbols of ambition, but beneath the surface, something fundamental has changed. The energy that once felt invigorating now feels strained. The movement that once inspired now overwhelms. The chaos that once made the city exciting now exposes the cracks no one wanted to see. And for the first time, visitors sense that New York is no longer in control of its own narrative. This is not about comparing the city to an unrealistic fantasy. It is about admitting that the city has entered a different phase, one marked by aging systems, rising disorder, and an atmosphere that quietly signals decline. The streets tell a different story than the marketing campaigns. The subway stations reveal truths that tourism videos refuse to show. The tension in the air, the uneven rhythm of public life, the subtle exhaustion in people's faces, these are signs of a metropolis struggling to sustain the weight of its own mythology. And yet travelers keep arriving expecting the old New York, the version passed down through decades of global admiration. But the moment they look closely, really closely, they realize they are walking through a city caught between who it was and who it is becoming. They feel the dissonance between the memory and the reality. They sense the erosion of the confidence the city once radiated effortlessly. They understand, even without having the words for it, that the New York of imagination only exists for those who still choose to live in the past. Maybe you have felt this too. Maybe you visited recently and noticed something you couldn't quite explain. Maybe the city felt different, heavier, somehow out of sync with the story you were told your whole life. If any part of this resonates with you, share your impressions in the comments so we can understand how this transformation appears through different eyes. And before you continue, tap the like button and check whether you are subscribed to the channel, because what comes next will help you see the city with even more clarity. The next layer of this story reveals why the New York people expect simply cannot be found anymore, and why the experience of visiting the city has shifted so dramatically, even for those who want to believe nothing has changed. The moment a visitor tries to reconnect the New York of imagination with the New York that unfolds before them, the dissonance becomes impossible to ignore. The mythical city they expected vibrant, cinematic, polished in its chaos, is replaced by an experience marked by fatigue, unpredictability, and a sense of erosion that lingers beneath the surface of every street. This is the moment when the myth finally breaks. Tourists walk through Manhattan expecting spectacle and are met instead with the unmistakable signs of a place struggling to hold itself together. The disappointment does not come from a single dramatic moment. It spreads slowly through dozens of small details that accumulate over the course of a visit. The overflowing trash cans in Midtown, the clusters of people gathered around malfunctioning transit entrances, the uneven pavement that makes walking more of an obstacle course than an urban pleasure. The noise, once a symbol of life, now feels abrasive. Even the iconic landmarks deliver less impact as the surrounding environment feels disorganized and worn down. The city's edges are showing and the illusion no longer holds. The tourist experience used to thrive on a sense of discovery. Every corner revealed something new, a hidden gem or unexpected encounter that added to the mythology. Now, many visitors describe the city as repetitive, commercialized, or strangely hollow. They feel pushed toward the same overcrowded areas while entire sections of the city feel inaccessible or uninviting. The curated fantasy that once defined travel videos and postcards has faded, replaced by a tired landscape that suggests strain rather than spontaneity. Travelers also feel the emotional contrast between expectation and reality. They arrive brimming with excitement, only to find themselves navigating frustrations that sap their enthusiasm. The crowds feel heavier, the lines longer, the interactions colder. Even the simple joy of walking through iconic streets loses its charm when every step feels like navigating a battlefield of noise, stress, and unpredictability. The magic that visitors anticipated dissolves into a sense of endurance rather than exploration. What intensifies this shift is the gap between memory and experience. Many visitors return to New York after years or decades, expecting to reconnect with the city they once knew. The shock they feel is sharper because they sense a deeper transformation, not the usual evolution of a major metropolis, but a decline in the qualities that once made New York exceptional. They speak of a city that feels thinner, stretched, and somehow less alive. The energy remains, but it lacks direction. The spirit remains, but it lacks cohesion. Even first-time visitors with no personal history to compare feel something is off. They pick up on the ambiance, the tension in the crowds, the fatigue embedded in everyday exchanges. They sense that the city is fighting against forces it can't fully manage. Instead of stepping into the iconic New York they imagined, they find themselves inside a version that feels fragmented, overwhelmed, and burdened by unresolved problems. But the most telling part of this shift is how quickly the realization spreads among travelers. Conversations in hotel lobbies, airport lounges, ride shares, and restaurants echo the same sentiment. The New York people imagine no longer exists. The city has changed faster than its reputation, creating a disconnect that leaves visitors conflicted. They want to love the city, but the experience pushes back at every turn. This is the moment when the myth finally dissolves, and it sets the stage for the deeper truth that becomes unavoidable once visitors look beyond the surface. The collapse of the tourist fantasy is only the beginning. What they are really seeing is the visible evidence of deeper structural problems that shape the city's daily reality. When visitors finally look beyond the emotional disconnect and start paying attention to the machinery of the city itself, the gap between imagination and reality grows even wider. The systems that once held New York together, its transportation network, its sanitation cycles, its energy grid, its public maintenance, are no longer functioning at the level that a global metropolis demands. These systems were once part of the city's invisible brilliance, quietly orchestrating the movement of millions. Now, their failures are impossible to ignore. And for tourists, these failures become the clearest sign that New York has entered a new phase of decline. The subway is often the first revelation. Visitors expect crowded platforms and fast movement, but not the unpredictable breakdowns, the stalled trains, the intense heat trapped in aging tunnels, or the persistent mechanical failures that interrupt even the simplest commute. What used to be organized chaos now feels more like a malfunctioning organism, one that creaks under pressure rather than adapting to it. Tourists sense this instinctively. They wait longer, they get lost more easily, and they begin to understand that the system no longer runs with the confidence it once had. Above ground, the deterioration becomes even more visible. Streets marked by constant construction zones that seem to linger for years, sidewalks patched unevenly, traffic signals malfunctioning during crucial hours, and intersections choked by gridlock that no longer resembles the vibrant urban hustle people expect. Visitors move through this environment with growing skepticism. They realize that the city's infrastructure is no longer evolving, it is being patched together, piece by piece, in a race against its own aging foundation. Sanitation amplifies this impression. Overflowing trash bins, streets lined with bags waiting for delayed collection, and the unmistakable mix of odors that intensify during the warmer months create an atmosphere that feels more neglected than dynamic. Tourists expecting a polished version of New York confront a visual reality that contradicts every postcard and movie scene. The level of waste exposure shocks many, particularly those from cities with stricter public cleaning systems. The disconnect is so sharp that it becomes a defining element of their experience. Even the city's public spaces, which once acted as relief points from the concrete intensity, show their own signs of wear. Parks reveal uneven pathways, fading infrastructure, damaged seating areas, and lawns that struggle to stay maintained under the weight of millions of visitors. What used to feel like moments of breathing space now feel more like reminders of how far behind the city has fallen in basic upkeep. Tourists sense this erosion, and it reinforces the idea that New York is stretching itself thin. The same is true for the energy grid. Tourists may not understand the technical details, but they experience the Consequences: first-hand brownouts in certain districts, flickering lights in transit stations, elevators and escalators frequently out of service, and indoor environments that feel poorly regulated. These failures highlight a city struggling to keep essential functions stable, especially under the immense pressure of its population and visitor flow. What visitors feel, more than anything, is instability. A sense that the systems responsible for the smooth functioning of daily life are no longer reliable. The once powerful infrastructure that symbolized American ingenuity now feels outdated, inconsistent, and fatigued. And because infrastructure is the backbone of any metropolitan experience, its decline reshapes everything else: how people move, how they feel, how they judge the city, and ultimately how they interpret the future of New York itself. This growing realization marks a critical turning point in the tourist's perception. The myth is no longer just broken. It is replaced by the undeniable evidence that the city's structural foundation is deteriorating, and that this deterioration is not temporary, it is systemic. And once this awareness settles, it leads directly into the next layer of discomfort that visitors feel as soon as they step deeper into the city's streets. As visitors spend more time navigating the city, another realization settles in, one that goes beyond infrastructure or aesthetics. It is the atmosphere itself, the emotional texture of New York today, that leaves tourists unsettled. Not because the city is loud or crowded, but because the tension that once fueled its legendary energy has taken on a different tone. What tourists now encounter is not ambition, not competitive drive, not the iconic sense of possibility. Instead, they feel exhaustion. A collective, unfiltered fatigue that hangs over the streets like a physical presence. New York was once defined by a unique duality: overwhelming intensity paired with the promise of upward movement. People rushed, competed, dreamed, and fought for space, but there was always a current of hope beneath it. That undercurrent has weakened. The speed remains, the noise remains, the density remains, but the emotional foundation has shifted. Many residents move through the city not with urgency, but with a kind of defensive alertness, eyes scanning, shoulders tense, attention divided between the environment and the next potential disruption. Tourists sense this immediately. This tension is amplified by the visible burnout of those who keep the city functioning. Service workers, once praised for their resilience, now appear overextended. Employees in restaurants, transportation hubs, hotels, and retail spaces often display the accumulated weight of labor shortages, increased pressure, and rising living costs. The warmth that visitors expect, or at least the efficient neutrality, has been replaced by strained interactions. Tourists notice shorter tempers, reduced patience, and a sense of emotional distance that reinforces the feeling that the city is operating at its limit. Even small interactions carry this weight. A delayed check-in, a driver visibly frustrated with traffic, a barista overwhelmed by the pace, or a store employee trying to manage simultaneous demands. These moments accumulate into a broader impression: New York is tired. And tired cities behave differently from merely busy ones. Tired cities react instead of lead. They absorb pressure instead of channeling it. And tourists, who come seeking the myth of endless vitality, are confronted with a version of New York that feels emotionally depleted. Public behavior reflects this shift as well. Crowds move with less coordination, personal boundaries feel thinner, and minor conflicts escalate quickly. Tourists often describe a noticeable edge in everyday interactions, as if the city's social fabric has been stretched too far. The legendary New York attitude, once interpreted as confident, bold, even charmingly direct, now leans toward irritability, impatience, and emotional volatility. The line between assertiveness and aggression has blurred. Visitors also feel the psychological impact of inequality more sharply than before. The contrast between extreme wealth and extreme struggle is no longer hidden behind iconic landmarks or vibrant cultural scenes. It is visible block by block. Luxury towers cast shadows over crumbling infrastructure, and high-end boutiques exist beside individuals sleeping on sidewalks. The emotional collision between these two realities generates a kind of cognitive dissonance that tourists cannot ignore. They came expecting inspiration. Instead, they witness contradiction. And contradictions create discomfort. They force visitors to confront the gap between the symbolic New York and the lived New York. The myth told them they were entering the center of modern prosperity. The reality shows them a city where many residents are simply pushing through each day. Tourists internalize this tension, and it reshapes their perception of everything around them. If you have ever visited New York and felt this shift, this emotional heaviness that lingers beneath the noise, share your experience in the comments. Your insights help reveal how much the city has truly changed in the eyes of those who arrive expecting the myth and encounter the reality. With this emotional landscape established, the next layer emerges naturally: how safety, public order, and everyday unpredictability have become defining elements of the modern New York experience, changing not only how residents live but how visitors interpret the city's future. As visitors continue exploring the city, one perception begins to overshadow all others: unpredictability. Not the exciting kind that once defined New York, the version that came from spontaneity, nightlife, cultural surprises, or the unexpected charm of urban chaos. Today's unpredictability feels different. It is heavier, less romantic, and far more destabilizing. For many tourists, what stands out is not danger in a cinematic sense, but the absence of a consistent social baseline. Streets that feel perfectly normal at noon may feel volatile by sunset. Areas known for calm suddenly erupt in disorder, and places once considered vibrant now oscillate between liveliness and tension with no warning. This shift is visible in public transportation more than anywhere else. The subway was always chaotic, but it operated under a predictable rhythm. Even at its worst, there was structure. Now, the system reflects the broader social fragmentation of the city. Platforms teem with individuals experiencing visible distress, shouting, pacing, or wandering without direction. Trains are frequently disrupted by episodes that make passengers uneasy: arguments, erratic behavior, sudden confrontations, or moments where the train stops due to police assistance without further explanation. Tourists, unaccustomed to interpreting these signals, absorb the emotional weight instantly. What used to be a symbol of urban adventure has become a symbol of instability. For many visitors, a single unsettling subway incident defines their entire impression of the city. They recount it later not as a story of New York authenticity, but as a warning. And these warnings spread quickly through travel communities, social media, and international tourism circles, contributing to the declining desire to return. Street-level unpredictability has also grown. Tourists encounter individuals yelling into the air, sudden disputes between strangers, aggressive panhandling, or people in visible crisis. Most of these situations do not escalate into violence, but they create a persistent sense of vulnerability. When unpredictability becomes the norm, visitors instinctively remain on guard. They walk faster, talk less, and look over their shoulders more often. The classic New York advice, "just keep moving now," feels less like a witty tip and more like a survival guideline. This environment also affects families and older travelers, groups that traditionally power the tourism economy. Parents hesitate to bring children into situations they cannot quickly evaluate. Older tourists, less agile and more risk-averse, feel unsafe in environments where disorder appears suddenly and without clear boundaries. Their discomfort shapes reviews, influences travel recommendations, and gradually redefines New York's reputation abroad. Unpredictability reshapes even the city's brightest attractions. Times Square is no longer just loud and theatrical. It is a space where performances, police presence, sensory overload, and erratic street behavior coexist in constant tension. Central Park remains beautiful, yet visitors note how rapidly the atmosphere can shift from calm to uneasy, depending on the time of day or the proximity of certain groups. Even iconic areas like the Brooklyn Bridge increasingly evoke mixed reactions from tourists who feel overwhelmed rather than inspired. What troubles many visitors is not harm itself, but the feeling that no neighborhood, time, or situation offers guaranteed stability. This uncertainty represents a profound sociological shift. It indicates not just incidents, but the erosion of predictable urban norms, the common expectations that allow strangers to coexist peacefully in dense environments. Cities rely on these invisible agreements, and when they weaken, people feel it immediately. For tourists, unpredictability becomes a filter through which every other aspect of New York is interpreted. Even when nothing happens, the expectation that something might happen drains their enjoyment and reshapes their perception of the city. If you want to follow documentaries that expose the real conditions of major global cities, consider subscribing. Every video reveals another layer of how modern urban systems rise, peak, and fracture under pressure. With the emotional and structural volatility now established, the next layer emerges almost automatically. The hidden mechanisms driving this shift: economic pressures, demographic changes, policy decisions, and systemic imbalances that tourists sense but cannot fully decode. As the underlying forces behind New York's instability become clearer, what unsettles visitors most is not the surface-level chaos, but the feeling that the system beneath the city is stretched thin. In a place built on density, speed, and constant economic pressure, small cracks quickly expand. Tourists notice subtle signs that locals learned long ago to ignore: the unusual number of businesses with paper signs taped to the windows, the slow disappearance of long-standing restaurants, the sudden turnover of storefronts replaced by temporary pop-ups that last only a few months. These patterns reveal a deeper structural strain that shapes the atmosphere of the city more than any single incident. Rising operational costs force many establishments to cut staff, reduce hours, or compromise service. Visitors accustomed to efficiency find themselves waiting longer, encountering overwhelmed employees, or navigating inconsistent service quality. What once felt like the energetic pulse of New York now feels like the exhaustion of a system trying to do too much with too little. Behind the scenes, these pressures stem from skyrocketing rents, supply chain complications, and a regulatory framework that burdens small businesses more heavily than large corporations. The result is an urban experience that feels increasingly uneven. Even the iconic parts of the city reflect this imbalance. Museums reduce exhibition spaces or staff availability, and major attractions operate at limited capacity during hours when tourists expect full operation. Hotel prices continue to soar while service quality declines, creating a frustrating contradiction for travelers. Visitors paying premium rates notice elevators under maintenance, housekeeping delays, or basic amenities that feel downgraded compared to pre-pandemic standards. This mismatch between cost and experience becomes one of the most frequently cited complaints among international tourists. Infrastructure magnifies this perception. Sidewalks show signs of wear, scaffolding dominates entire blocks, and construction noise becomes an unavoidable background. Visitors walking through Manhattan often remark that the city feels permanently under repair, as if every street is in transition yet never finished. Delayed subway renovations, patchwork roadwork, and stalled development projects create a sense that the city is both moving and stuck at the same time. Another layer emerges from demographic shifts. Many long-term residents have left, while new populations arrive without the same cultural anchors that once stabilized communities. This creates neighborhoods with high turnover, where social cohesion feels thin and interactions between strangers lack the familiarity that previously defined New York streets. Tourists sense this emptiness even if they cannot name it. A city without rooted residents loses part of its character, and visitors pick up on the emotional void that comes from transience. Economic polarization intensifies the experience. Wealth and poverty coexist more visibly than ever, often occupying the same block. Luxury high-rises shadow shelters, upscale cafes sit beside struggling businesses, and high-end retail stores operate next to vacant storefronts. For visitors, this visual contrast creates an unsettling cognitive dissonance. The city still projects wealth, but the foundation supporting that image seems fragile. Tourists interpret the contrast as instability rather than diversity, as if the city is balancing on opposing extremes that no longer coexist harmoniously. Public services reflect this strain too. Trash collection appears inconsistent, leading to overflowing bins in tourist-heavy areas. Street lighting varies dramatically between neighborhoods, affecting visitors walking after sunset. Emergency services seem present, but stretched, with sirens echoing constantly, reinforcing the perception of a city under stress. These subtle signals shape how outsiders measure a city's health, and they increasingly view New York as a place where the system is functioning, but barely. Visitors do not need detailed reports, policy analysis, or economic data to sense these underlying mechanisms. They feel it through the atmosphere, through interactions, through disruptions that repeat across different boroughs and settings. What they interpret as instability often reflects systemic pressures cascading from deeper layers of urban complexity. This slow accumulation of tension affects the way travelers talk about the city. Instead of celebrating its uniqueness, they describe a place struggling to maintain its identity under mounting pressures. Their impressions become part of a larger narrative, shared online and in person, gradually reshaping how the world imagines New York today. As visitors move through the city trying to make sense of the contradictions they encounter, many begin to notice something that goes beyond the physical or economic decay. They start to feel the emotional weight of the city's unraveling identity. New York has always been intense, but the intensity now feels different. Instead of excitement, many describe pressure. Instead of the electric unpredictability that once defined the city, they feel a kind of uncertainty that makes even simple interactions feel heavier than expected. It becomes obvious that the social fabric that once held the city together is thinning, and tourists can sense it even before they fully understand it. Part of this comes from the way people interact, or fail to interact, with each other. The spontaneous conversations, the street performers that once created pockets of joy, the familiar rhythm of crowds who somehow managed to move in sync despite their diversity, these elements are not as present as they used to be. Visitors often describe the feeling of walking through a city where people coexist physically but remain emotionally detached. They see commuters avoiding eye contact, service workers moving with mechanical haste, and pedestrians navigating sidewalks as if in their own isolated worlds. The city's famous energy feels fragmented. This fragmentation is amplified by social and economic pressures that push residents into survival mode. Rising housing costs force families to work longer hours, juggle multiple jobs, or relocate entirely. Neighborhoods that once had strong cultural identities now feel unstable, with long-standing communities displaced and replaced by temporary populations that bring activity but not continuity. For visitors expecting authenticity, this shift creates a sense of disorientation. They look for the New York they imagined and instead find pockets of a city in transition, struggling to define what it wants to be. Technology also reshapes the emotional terrain of the city. The rise of delivery services, remote work, and algorithm-driven communication means fewer face-to-face interactions. Tourists walk through busy streets yet struggle to find the sense of human connection that once defined New York. They notice people glued to their phones, neighborhoods where foot traffic feels transactional rather than communal, and public spaces where interactions feel scripted rather than spontaneous. The city's famed social vibrancy quietly erodes. And then there is the tension that comes from polarization. New York has always contained opposing worlds, but those worlds are now drifting further apart, leaving a visible gap that visitors cannot ignore. The ultra-wealthy move through the city insulated from public spaces, creating micro-environments that feel disconnected from the reality most residents experience. Meanwhile, others struggle to meet basic needs. Tourists walking between these extremes see a fractured urban landscape, pockets of privilege surrounded by signs of strain. The contrast generates a subtle anxiety, as if the city is balancing on a fragile equilibrium. Public spaces reveal this tension. Parks feel less communal and more like temporary refuges. Subway platforms carry a mix of exhaustion and vigilance. Busy avenues feel rushed but lack the old sense of shared purpose. Even iconic locations feel different because the emotional tone of the people in them has changed. What visitors interpret as atmosphere is in reality a collective psychological landscape shaped by economic pressure, social fragmentation, and institutional neglect. Tourists often describe the experience as confusing. The city is still crowded, still noisy, still full of life, but something essential feels out of alignment. The underlying emotion of New York no longer matches the mythology that drew millions to it. Instead of the inspiring chaos of a bustling metropolis, they feel the weight of a system stretched thin and communities struggling to adapt. This emotional dissonance becomes one of the strongest reasons why many people leave the city feeling unsettled. As this emotional disconnect spreads, visitors contribute to a growing global narrative. They share stories not only of crime or infrastructure, but of the intangible feeling that New York is losing its center. And these personal perceptions quickly become collective truths, shaping the city's reputation in ways that physical data alone cannot measure. Before we continue, tell me what you think about this emotional shift. Have you ever felt a city changing not because of what you saw, but because of what you sensed? Dek su comentario compartilhando suavisao sobre essa transformação invisível. As visitors try to interpret the emotional fragmentation they feel in New York, another layer of discomfort emerges from something they encounter repeatedly, but rarely understand on a deeper level: the overwhelming sense of unpredictability that now shapes everyday experiences in the city. This unpredictability goes beyond the typical hustle for which New York was once known. It has become a form of instability that affects how people move, interact, and even think while navigating the urban landscape. Tourists expecting energetic spontaneity instead find a city where unpredictability feels risky rather than exciting. One of the clearest examples is the inconsistency of public spaces. A park that feels safe and lively in the afternoon can feel tense at twilight. A subway line that runs smoothly in the morning can suddenly shut down or become overcrowded without warning. Even major avenues experience abrupt shifts in atmosphere depending on the hour, the crowd, or the events happening nearby. This instability creates a sense of mental fatigue for visitors who are not accustomed to constantly recalibrating their expectations. Much of this unpredictability emerges from resource strain. Police presence appears inconsistent, sanitation services vary widely between neighborhoods, and public infrastructure seems reactive instead of proactive. Tourists notice small yet telling signs: an area that is spotless one day and cluttered with trash the next, a station with well-functioning turnstiles followed by another where machines are broken or malfunctioning. These irregularities form a mosaic of disorder that visitors interpret as a sign of deeper systemic dysfunction. The way people respond to this environment amplifies the effect. Residents develop adaptive behaviors, moving quickly, staying alert, limiting unnecessary interactions, and avoiding certain areas at specific times. Tourists who observe these patterns instinctively mirror them, even without knowing why. They walk faster, speak less with strangers, and scan their surroundings more often. The city's tension becomes contagious. What used to be the thrill of navigating an iconic metropolis now feels like managing uncertainty at every corner. Economic activity reflects this volatility too. Street vendors appear and disappear unpredictably. Some neighborhoods thrive one month and decline the next. And the flow of tourists itself fluctuates based on news cycles and global perceptions. Visitors wandering through these shifts often feel they are witnessing a city trying to maintain momentum while grappling with forces that pull it in conflicting directions. Result is a landscape that feels constantly in flux, a place where stability is no longer a defining feature. Even cultural spaces mirror this inconsistency. Theaters adjust showtimes or close unexpectedly. Galleries operate with limited staff or reduced hours. Small venues that once fostered artistic experimentation now struggle to stay open, creating an uneven cultural experience for visitors seeking the creative essence of New York. For many, these fluctuations undermine the city's reputation as a reliable hub of art, music, and culture. Local conversations add another layer. Visitors overhear residents discussing rising prices, unpredictable service, transportation delays, and disruptions that seem to repeat endlessly. They read reviews describing inconsistent experiences, with some days feeling manageable and others burdened by unexpected issues. These shared frustrations form a collective narrative that tourists absorb, even if they spend only a few days in the city. The unpredictability also affects how people perceive safety. Even in areas that are statistically stable, sudden changes in crowd density, lighting, or noise can make visitors feel uneasy. When the environment fluctuates so frequently, perception often outweighs reality. Tourists may not be able to explain the exact cause, but they sense that the city no longer provides a consistent baseline of security. This feeling becomes one of the most powerful psychological barriers for anyone considering a return trip. What makes this instability particularly impactful is that it contradicts the very illusion that once defined New York, the global image of a city that never stops, never falters, and never loses control stands in sharp contrast to the lived experience of visitors today. They come expecting a well-oiled urban machine and instead find a place governed by shifting variables. The gap between expectation and reality becomes the source of disappointment and eventually of avoidance. This unpredictable environment does not push visitors away through dramatic incidents. Instead, it wears them down through an accumulation of small irregularities that shape their overall perception. Each unexpected delay, each abrupt change in atmosphere, and each moment of confusion becomes another piece in the puzzle of why people hesitate to return. And as these impressions circulate globally through social media, conversations, and travel platforms, they gradually reshape the world's sense of what New York has become. As travelers continue observing the unpredictable rhythm of New York, another pattern begins to emerge, one that is less visible but just as impactful: the erosion of the city's confidence. For generations, New York projected an aura of certainty, a sense that no matter what happened economically, politically, or socially, the city would adapt, reinvent itself, and keep moving forward. Visitors felt this resilience even if they did not understand its origins. It was embedded in the streets, the attitude of the people, the determination woven into its culture. Yet now, many tourists describe a subtle but unmistakable shift. The self-assuredness that once defined the city feels weakened, replaced by hesitation and doubt. This shift is most apparent in the way institutions react to pressure. Decisions that once seemed bold now appear reactive or tentative. Tourists encounter temporary measures, short-term fixes, and a general sense that key systems are being patched rather than strengthened. They see construction projects stalled, public services struggling to keep pace, and agencies responding to problems instead of anticipating them. This creates an environment where visitors feel that the city is always one step behind its own challenges. Businesses reflect the same uncertainty. Many are reluctant to take risks or invest in long-term improvements. Tourists notice this through small details: menus that have not been updated in years, interiors that feel worn, staff turnover that disrupts consistency, and storefronts that feel more like placeholders than thriving enterprises. The entrepreneurial spirit that once defined New York now competes with caution, and visitors sense this tension in the very experience of walking through commercial districts. The city's cultural identity also appears conflicted. While New York's past was shaped by confident artistic experimentation, what visitors encounter now is often a mix of nostalgia and hesitation. Institutions cling to what once worked instead of daring to innovate. Small venues struggle to survive. Even long-standing cultural institutions feel stretched, trying to maintain relevance while grappling with limited resources. Tourists expecting bold expression instead encounter curated safe zones that feel more cautious than creative. This erosion of confidence becomes even more visible in public discourse. Conversations overheard on subways, in cafes, or on street corners reveal a population unsure about the city's trajectory. Residents debate rising costs, declining services, unstable governance, and a sense that the city's future is more fragile than it once appeared. Visitors pick up on this collective uncertainty. They may not understand the specifics, but they feel the underlying anxiety shaping the atmosphere. The psychological tone of the city shifts under these conditions. Tourists describe it as a place caught between what it once was and what it fears becoming. This limbo-like state affects the way people move, interact, and perceive their surroundings. The confidence that once energized crowds now feels diluted, replaced by a cautious pace and an air of unpredictability. When the emotional center of a city weakens, the experience of being there changes in ways that statistics cannot capture. Urban environments thrive on momentum, and New York's momentum feels disrupted. The city's economic engines still run, but with uneven rhythm. Its cultural institutions still function, but with diminished intensity. Its public systems still operate, but without the reliability that once defined them. This slowdown in collective drive shapes how visitors interpret the city's identity. They sense not only the practical inconveniences but also the deeper loss of vitality. What stands out to travelers is that this decline is not dramatic or catastrophic. It is gradual, cumulative, and felt most strongly in the spaces between events. It is in the delayed train, the half-empty restaurant, the faded signage, the overworked staff, the inconsistent service, the vacant storefronts, the conversations about leaving, the quiet resignation in daily routines. These details accumulate into a narrative that visitors internalize without fully realizing it. This is how perception shifts. A decade ago, New York felt unshakable. Today, to many tourists, it feels uncertain. Not broken, not collapsing, but unsure of itself. A city aware that changes happening faster than its systems can adapt. A city whose myth still towers globally, while its lived reality reveals a different, more fragile truth. Visitors do not need charts or reports to sense this. They absorb it from the atmosphere, from the way people carry themselves, from the way the city reacts to pressure. And once they notice this loss of confidence, it becomes one more element shaping their decision about whether to return. Because people rarely revisit a place that feels unsure of its own direction. As visitors absorb the subtle loss of confidence shaping New York's atmosphere, the most powerful realization comes from observing how these perceptions form a feedback loop that influences the city's future. A place that once defined global urban ambition now finds itself facing a quiet erosion of trust, not only from residents but from those who arrive expecting the legendary version of the city they grew up imagining. When travelers sense instability, their behavior shifts. They stay in different neighborhoods, avoid certain areas, shorten their itineraries, or choose alternative destinations entirely. These small individual choices accumulate, shaping patterns that ripple across tourism, local businesses, and the broader urban ecosystem. This shift becomes most visible in conversations shared online. Travelers document their frustrations, not through dramatic events, but through the steady accumulation of inconsistencies they experience during their stay. Their stories spread quickly, forming a global narrative that influences the decisions of others. The myth of New York remains strong, but it now competes with first-hand accounts describing a city struggling to match its former promise. Visitors expecting excitement describe exhaustion. Those seeking vibrancy describe imbalance. And those searching for cultural richness describe fragmentation. These impressions matter because tourism relies heavily on emotional expectation. The paradox is that New York still possesses the raw ingredients that once made it extraordinary. The density, the cultural diversity, the architectural drama, the relentless motion, all remain part of its identity. What has changed is the coherence that once held these elements together. Travelers sense a disconnect between potential and execution, as if the city is caught in a transitional phase where the future is uncertain and the past is fading. This tension shapes every interaction, from transportation to dining to simple walks through the streets. Urban psychologists often highlight that cities communicate not through words but through atmosphere. When the atmosphere becomes inconsistent, people respond instinctively. Visitors who once felt energized by New York's pace now feel drained by its volatility. Those who once admired its unpredictability now hesitate in the face of instability. The city's power came from its ability to make people feel part of something bigger than themselves. When that feeling weakens, the entire urban experience shifts. Yet even amid these changes, travelers describe moments of the old New York breaking through. A sudden burst of street music, a spontaneous conversation, a skyline moment that still inspires awe. These fragments remind them of why the city once captured the world's imagination. But the contrast between these moments and the broader atmosphere creates a kind of emotional whiplash. It reinforces the sense that New York is living between two versions of itself, still capable of greatness, but hindered by structural and social tensions that visitors cannot ignore. This tension becomes the central theme of the modern tourist experience. People leave the city not with a single complaint, but with a mosaic of impressions that shape a new narrative. A narrative in which New York remains iconic but no longer unquestionable, powerful but no longer invincible, magnetic but no longer consistent. And for many travelers, that shift is enough to reconsider whether they want to return. If you have followed the story up to this point, it means you understand how these subtle layers shape the way people see one of the most influential cities in the world. And if this reflection resonated with you, feel free to share your perspective in the comments using a simple phrase like "I stayed until the end." It helps me understand how this content reaches you and what parts connect the most. If the insights here added value to your understanding of urban decline and perception, consider subscribing to the channel. It is a way to stay connected to this type of analysis without missing future breakdowns. And if the conversation made sense to you, leaving a like is a natural way to support the work. There is another video right here on the side that expands these ideas and complements everything we explored. Click it whenever you want to continue with me there, keeping this line of thought alive while we go deeper into what is really behind the decline of major cities.